It is a prime ingredient, feeding the fires of imagination. In eons past, it fanned flames ignited by a primeval author, chiseling random petroglyphs across a dim cave wall. This life-giving breeze once grew papyrus for paper and dried vibrant oils brushed over canvas. Carried across the land since the dawn of time, it once breathed life into dinosaurs and has since walked on the surface of the moon. Manifesting as a gentle zephyr, it stirs memories of childhood, or as a raging vortex, ripping up the pages of history. Powered by this influence, we dream, love, laugh, hate, and destroy. In short, live out our lives. A gust of this tempest carries the power to scatter fog surrounding the unknown. Drifting through frequencies of time and space, thin air is inhaled for the first time and exhaled at the last. Don't try to catch your breath. The date is Tuesday, November 15th, 1988. Of particular interest, today is the day the Soviet Union will launch a Buran-class orbiter, the Russian equivalent to America's space shuttle. This will be the first and last time such an event will ever take place, for very shortly the communist state will dissolve into history, taking with it many of the grand designs that its rocket scientists held so dear. Strapped to the side of a giant Energia rocket, the orbiter is catapulted skyward into a veil of stars, automated and unmanned. The projected mission plan to make 2 complete orbits around the Earth and then fly back like an airplane, touching down approximately 200 minutes from launch. That's the projected mission. Unbeknownst to the scientists, ground crew, and military personnel who have made the mission possible, this particular orbiter will not remain unmanned for long. For even as we speak, Tate Addison is suiting up, about to become a passenger aboard this ill-fated flight. As the delicate fabric of time continues to unravel and tangle back upon itself, Buran's flight path will become snagged inside an abandoned hangar of the future, a point of trajectory that is to become the ultimate destination and final resting place for this star-crossed spaceship. Life support as yet unavailable inside the cockpit. Tate will have considerably less time than the flight duration to find a way out. The clock is operating, and the oxygen meter on his suit reads T-minus 20 minutes and counting. Time is of the essence, Mr. Addison, as is the precious residual thin air for you to breathe. I awoke restrained. How or why, I couldn't be sure. I can only speculate based on past experience, said experience being a narrow escape in the wilderness, seconds away from being mauled by some kind of mythic wild animal as I scrambled across the threshold of yet another unexplained dimensional doorway. Boy, does that sound like a load of crap or what? I asked aloud. Surprised by the strangely enclosed, muffled sound of my own voice, coupled with seeing my breath fogging up the inside surface of some kind of clear plexiglass faceplate, I reached out and tried to wipe away the condensation with my hand, and realized that my fingers were now heavily encased inside a pair of thick rubber and metal gloves. That's it, I deduced. The medics have finally caught up with me and have decided to strap me down inside some sort of elaborate straitjacket. No doubt they've long since decided to throw away the key. They're coming to take me away, ho-ho, hee-hee, ha-ha, I sang to myself, where life is beautiful all the time, blah, 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 blah. I heard that somewhere. It seemed sort of apropos, sitting here, tied down and motionless, patiently waiting for my first dose of prescribed tranquilizers. Tugging at my bonds to test their resiliency, I saw that, in fact, this was really more of a safety harness, crisscrossing my chest in an X shape and clipping in on all four sides to heavy metal buckles bolted to my chair. Interesting choice of detainment, I noted. If I didn't know any better, I'd say they had me all bundled up inside something close to a spacesuit. By now, I'd decided that the curved plexi was only part of a much larger apparatus on my head, and the whole of it seemed to bear a striking resemblance to the inside of a space helmet. Gazing out through the glass, I decided that this was no rubber room I was incarcerated in either. There before me were rows and rows of dials, levers, and even a long control stick extending up from the metal floor to within an ideal position for my hands. "Oh my God," I exclaimed. "This is a spacesuit, and I'm strapped down in the pilot's chair of some kind of space craft." My brain reeled as I desperately fidgeted with the belt, trying to find the latch. As I sat there groping for a way to unhook myself, a sudden burst of static crackled over the headset inside the helmet. After several seconds of modulated noise, a man's voice broke in, speaking in a foreign language I couldn't decipher on the spur of the moment. As it turned out, there was no need to understand the words. I knew exactly what he was saying, and the realization made my blood run cold. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I never heard whether or not he made the countdown to 0, because at that moment, hell literally broke loose all around me. In through a row of windows directly in front of me flared a light as bright and blinding as the sun, flooding the compartment with illumination that could have and would have easily burned away my retinas had I not turned away and raised both arms in front of my visor. The cockpit chamber shook violently as untold pounds of thundering thrust was unleashed below me, slamming against the ground until gravity itself finally relinquished its hold and allowed my ship to slip the infamously surly bonds of Earth. I could feel the G-forces pressing me down against the chair like a vice, as if some unseen hand was holding me back until I could withstand no more, about to be squished like an ant beneath the boot of some omnipresent power that didn't want me going where I eventually had no other choice but to go. As the rocket cleared the tower and started accelerating in a dizzying upward arc, I saw the clouds in the sky above the launch pad come racing at the windows and then completely blot out the view ahead. In the wink of an eye, my rocket ship broke out above the cloud cover and rose like a burning flame at the tip of a contrail candle, high into the blackness at the edge of the atmosphere. For a momentary interval, a rush of nostalgia literally brought tears to my eyes. You see, I grew up in Titusville, Florida, back during the heady days of Columbia, Discovery, Challenger, and Atlantis. Never missed a launch. I was there the day we lost Challenger, and I cried then, too. I couldn't see the towering pillar of clouds in my wake lying flat on my back, pinned down like an insect in a display case, but I knew it was back there nonetheless. Never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined being out on the leading edge of it like an honest-to-God astronaut. Well, cosmonaut in this case, I suppose. The telltale hammer and sickle patch on the arm of my suit was a convenient reminder. I knew now that the countdown transmission from my headset was most likely Russian as well. Sadly, I'm no history major. I still have no idea what particular space mission I was on, other than the fact that it was unmanned. Figures. It's getting pretty lonely being me these days. The only living human who tried to set foot in my world lately was the mystery man back in Fuerteventura, and he never so much as extended me a grace wave. Oh well. Not much time for conversation anyway. By now the violent vibrations inside the cabin were tapering off to a low, almost imperceptible rumble as I surmised that wherever I was going, we must be close enough to turn off the seatbelt sign. That is, of course, if there was a seatbelt sign. I can't read Russian either. Considerably calmer now than I was seconds away from launch, I located the latch on my harness and easily unbuckled it. As soon as I had slipped my arms out from under the straps, I immediately started to drift up out of my chair, my first unexpected encounter with zero gravity. Like a child in a bounce house, I kicked off from the backrest of the seat and did a complete double somersault to the back of the crew compartment, clumsily bouncing against the back wall until I could grab hold of some sort of handhold. All of a sudden, there was a strong vibration, like something hitting the spacecraft, causing the cabin and all of its contents to shudder. Assuming it's true that there is no sound in space, I could only conjecture as to the cause. Instinctively, I pulled myself in the direction of the nearest viewport, situated in the center of an outer door, or what the astronauts used to call an egress hatch. At first, all I could see was an incredible vista of stars beyond the vaulted blue horizon of planet Earth, so stunning that I started crying all over again. Maybe for the first time since this crazy odyssey started, I took a long moment to appreciate what I was seeing. In that single instant, I thought how tragic it is that everyone riding that big blue marble around the sun could not share it from my perspective. Maybe words and phrases like global warming, greenhouse gases, radioactive half-life, and red tide wouldn't be a part of today's vocabulary. Whatever day this happens to be, that is. As I drifted there, taking the scene in, I realized that I was looking out across the top of a long, curved wing. This was a shuttle. What was it? The name, what the Soviets called their version. Buran, the Buran Orbiter, USSR's take on a reusable space plane. I was riding aboard the Buran. As pitiful as my knowledge of world history was, I did remember that the Buran flew one successful remote-controlled mission and, much to my considerable relief, landed safely back on good old terra firma after a couple of orbits around the far side and back. I'll admit that as I peered out across the checkerboard of heat tiles caking every square inch of the ship, I was more than a little concerned that there seemed to be an alarming number of tiles missing. Not only that, the condition of all the tiles remaining was, quite frankly, appalling. The skin was littered with dust and grime and pockmarked with cracks and considerable dents. I've seen plenty of shuttles on the runway after touching down at Cape Kennedy, and not one of them ever looked to be in this advanced semblance of disrepair. I wasn't altogether sure, but I even thought I saw small, drifting particles of debris floating around out there like flies buzzing around a garbage can, the analogy oddly fitting as I tried to paint a verbal picture in my head to describe the advanced state of decay. There was no way that all this damage happened minutes ago on the way up. Just like my illustrious ocean liner and the broken-down Pullman car, this space shuttle hardly seemed mission-ready at all. As it stood, not even worthy of a historical museum piece. It almost seemed that I was taking my one small step for man in a jalopy that had spent most of its twilight years in some desolate corner of an aircraft boneyard. Painfully aware that something was way off kilter, I started scanning the crew cabin for similar signs of deterioration. It didn't take long to spot something else that was very, very wrong. At least 2 of the 6 windows or viewports lining the cockpit above the instrument panel were broken. Not just cracked, I mean literally broken out with no protective glass left in the frame at all, just a few pointed shards protruding from what should have been an airtight rubber seal. Needless to say, my heart sank. Glancing back outside, I saw what I believe was most likely the cause of the vibration from before. Falling away and beginning to spark and glow from contact with the atmosphere were the solid rocket boosters and external fuel tank, now spent and cast off to burn up in re-entry. Angry for them having brought me here, I cursed the spent hardware aloud as the pieces tumbled and dropped out of sight, streaking down like man-made comets to finally disintegrate and flicker out of existence. Well, I guess that's that, I told myself with a sigh. Houston, we have a very big problem, I shouted sarcastically into the helmet microphone. Sadly, it wasn't their problem. Feeling the need to be grounded to something while I mulled things over, I drifted back over to the captain's chair, pulled myself into a sitting position, and refastened the harness. As I was pulling the straps around myself, I felt the metal connector on one of my gloves come into contact with some sort of apparatus attached to the suit. It wasn't easy, but I managed to lean down far enough to look over the bottom lip of my helmet and saw that the object in question was an oxygen hose connected to a metal valve with a pressure gauge attached. Tugging at the hose, I managed to bring the face of the gauge close enough to my visor. I couldn't read the words, but below the label was a semicircle of tick marks running around the outer edge of the glass face. At 5-degree increments, the marks spelled out exactly how much air I had left to work with. 20 minutes. 20 frickin' minutes of oxygen remaining on a whirlwind trip twice around the Earth. Something tells me this isn't going to be enough, I lamented. If ever I needed a mysterious fourth dimension escape route, the time is now, I complained aloud, hoping that somehow the powers that be might overhear and respond. Concluding that sitting here and feeling sorry for myself while the air runs out and my face turns a cool shade of cyan was not the most constructive use of my time. I should at least have a look around the ship for signs of another gateway. With no blueprint or schematic to inspect, I had no idea how much ground I needed to cover, other than my knowledge of this orbiter's American counterpart. If the construction was essentially the same, there was a crew cabin or flight deck I currently occupied, a lower or mid-level forward compartment, and, of course, a spacious cargo bay with plenty of unexplored area that might occupy one of those handy-dandy, life-saving wormholes. For the moment, at least, Baran was following a trajectory around the daylight side of Earth, and so additional lighting was, at least for the time being, unnecessary. By the time the shuttle crosses over into night, it'll be too late to see where I'm going, anyhow. I almost chuckled when I remembered the coin in my pocket. If I was going to be found by the ground crew, all stretched out and dead as a doornail, I should at the very least have 2 matching pieces of change covering my lifeless eyes. Note to self, I thought. Let's hope a clumsy technician may have dropped a stray ruble or 2 on the deck. Gliding across the chamber to the mid-deck access ladder, I pulled myself down through the passage and took a quick look around. No items of interest. Not much of anything to see, really. Just broken fragments of glass, pieces of foam, and other abstract materials hanging in midair like mutant fish in a broken aquarium. No signs at all of the glowing ether vortex I so desperately needed to locate. Turning my attention to a large convex aperture leading out to the cargo bay, I placed both of my gloved hands firmly on the door release and gave it a subtle tug. It didn't budge an inch. Just like every other system in this abandoned spacecraft, the handle was frozen in place from what must have been years of neglect. Brushing a thick coating of dust and dingy soot off the hatchway porthole, I squinted and tried to see out into the expanse. Unlike the crew cabins, the cargo space was dark and obscure, save one long crack of light filtering in from above, apparently projecting past a gap between the cargo bay doors. If the long, vaulted room out there was exposed to the void of space, it was most certainly decompressed like the crew cabin, and equally as useless as a place of refuge to extend my meager oxygen supply. Considering the absence of all things supernatural, the pitch-black darkness beyond the porthole effectively crushed any hope of divine intervention as well. If it's of any solace at all, my dude, I told myself, at least I won't be a floating corpseicle out here for the rest of eternity. 2 orbits, and then I can have a proper burial. After all I've experienced, I think I deserve a little rest now. In peace? Yeah, That sounded pretty good at the moment, too. All I need to do is just twist the helmet seal to one side and poof, gone in a puff of frozen O2. As I floated there, tinkering with the connector and entertaining the thought of oblivion, something reflected a brilliant flash of sunlight across the dim wall in front of me. You know, it's funny. Every time I sit back and resign myself to letting the credits roll, something always seems to rear its big ugly boot and give me a swift kick in the ass. Here, as I played out a scene from my own personal reboot of Lost in Space, a tiny glimmer of hope revealed itself to me and effectively pulled me back to the business at hand. "Damn it, Tate," I exclaimed while drifting back to the cockpit windows. "Don't you ever give up?" But sure enough, there it was. Clear as a full moon, framed in front of the obsidian, star-filled void beyond the window, the spiral opening to who knows where shimmered like a cobalt-blue cyclone in the night, twisting end over end a short distance off the right wing of the orbiter. Waves of relief washed over me like a cool stream, returning my elevated heart rhythm back to a near-normal pace. Then, a mere instant later, futility dashed my newfound hope against the proverbial rocks. Asteroids, I suppose, since I'm all the way out here. At any rate, this eagerly anticipated dimensional rip in the fabric of space-time was just that, out there, in space, inaccessible. My mind was racing with potential solutions to the problem. Break orbit and fly the shuttle through? Climb out with a tether and try to spacewalk over? Did this ship come equipped with one of those fancy robot arms? Maybe I could extend it across the distance and shimmy over. I know, all laughable. This opening didn't look any bigger around than the one that formed around the train car. The Buran was huge, no possible way it would fit. Also, breaking orbit with a burn from one of the thrusters would no doubt alter my trajectory and foil any hope for a successful re-entry. What's the difference to me? I'm dead anyway, just like Major Tom. I'll be coming home, for sure. No, that's not an option. Even if I'm a goner, taking the orbiter off course could bring it raining down fire and brimstone over some poor, unsuspecting bystanders. In the time that it took me to weigh all these ridiculous actions, I could see that it wouldn't be long before the portal would be a vanishing beacon in the far-flung distance behind the ship, unattainable. Risking another big dose of reality, I took another look at the oxygen gauge. 5 more minutes. If I didn't do something now, cruel fate wasn't about to give me a stay of execution this time. Adding insult to injury, I could sense that my breathing was now becoming labored as I started to inhale the last remaining pockets of air in the tank. Go time. Kicking off from the cockpit chair with all my remaining strength, I careened back across the deck to the egress hatch and caught hold of the release bar. If this one was stuck, well, that would be that. Holding what was left of my breath and firmly bracing myself against the bulkhead, I gave the lever a good, strong turn. There was a slight snap of resistance at first, and then the latch slowly rotated, grudgingly, to the unlocked position. No fanfare, no hiss or corresponding blast of escaping pressure, just a barely perceptible metallic click, and then the hatch literally broke free and dropped. Yeah, I said dropped, straight down from the rounded egress opening, slamming against something out there with a resounding clang. Now, remember what I said a while ago, something about how sound doesn't carry through the vacuum of space? Well, for some reason this time, it did. Not only was there a loud, sustained impact sound, there was also a distinct clatter of smaller objects, spilling as a result. Reaching a noisy crescendo, the commotion actually went on to spawn a tapering series of rattling echoes that bounced back from somewhere out there, further confounding my disbelief. The crew cabin had seemingly depressurized long ago, or, for all I know, was never pressurized in the first place. This intentionally unmanned mission had no need for life support systems, though honestly, no system I know of would have been capable of producing breathable oxygen inside a capsule with broken windows. All of these facts taken into consideration, there was no violent equalization with the environment outside the orbiter. Near as I could tell, there never would have been, though all of this didn't explain away zero gravity aboard Buran. Inside the ship, things were still floating around here and there, completely unaware of Newton's law. Outside the exit hatch, it seemed, was an entirely different matter. With all but a few meager whiffs of air left to me, I decided to leave these anomalies to ponder with the powers that be. Sitting down on the lip of the doorframe, I dangled my legs out, then carefully turned and lowered myself until I hung from the ship by nothing more than my fingers alone. Letting go of the opening, I only dropped a few feet before landing on solid ground. Cold, hard concrete, to be specific. The hatch door had indeed fallen, hit a table stacked with miscellaneous junk, and then had skidded beneath the wing of the orbiter, clearing the way for me to touch down without incident. Sensing that my oxygen was now completely spent, I quickly twisted my helmet to separate it from the suit, and wasted no time in breaking the seal and lifting it off of my head. Still holding my breath, I finally decided to test my resolve and let the last bit of air escape from my lungs. If there was any more of the life-giving element left to be had, I was about to find out. I inhaled. Cold, stale, and yet plentifully abundant, I started breathing again, long, deep inhalations that finally convinced me that maybe, just maybe, my number hadn't come up black 13 this time either, contrary to believing that it had. Hoping I would have no further need for it, I dropped the helmet on the floor next to me, discarding it for future reference, or perhaps leaving it there for the next intradimensional, time-traveling schmuck that decides to take up the perilous rigors of spaceflight. Wherever this was that I had ended up may not be space, though it sure as hell was equally as cold. All of my newfound breathing was literally pumping out a cloud of fog around my head. Stepping away from the proximity to my time-worn spacecraft, I twisted the cuffs of my gloves and discarded them as well, then tugged at the zippered lapel of the suit until it peeled away from my chest, revealing that I had on the same dark blue t-shirt underneath. No wardrobe change for this particular incarnation, I suppose. Though I was very tempted to remove myself from the suit altogether, I felt it was just a bit nippy here for shorts and a shirt. No reason to add hypothermia to my short list of abnormalities. Now, as you well know, I've found myself in a lot of precarious spots lately. Free climbing what was left of an old ocean liner, chased by a hungry Yeti, and yes, most recently, commandeered as a reluctant Soviet cosmonaut on a spaceflight that didn't need one in the first place. Taking all this into consideration, still nothing could have prepared me for this latest predicament. Here I was, standing alone inside a colossal and seemingly abandoned building, next to a dilapidated space plane that I could scarcely believe had the wherewithal to deliver me here. With an unforgivingly clear view to assess my ship's flight worthiness, my singular recommendation would have been an unconditional no. Buran sat there with only 2 of its 3 tricycle landing gear fully extended, the third strut mangled with wheels and tires nowhere in sight. The missing heat shield situation was far worse than I could see from the flight deck. The battered underbelly, arguably the most vulnerable surface of the fuselage during fiery re-entry, was missing almost as many tiles as there were still in place. Around front, and looking every bit like a defeated boxer who had gone 12 rounds with a heavyweight asteroid, the orbiter's nose cone was broken and bent, exposing delicate skin underneath, certainly no match for a return trip through the friction firestorm back to Earth. The dirt and gritty residue I noticed covering the hull of my ship was everywhere, coating every square inch of the giant warehouse like a thick blanket of filthy snowfall. "Wait a minute," I exclaimed. "This isn't..." Is it? Reaching down at my feet, I scooped up a handful of the powdery grit. Snow! I couldn't believe what I was stirring around in the palm of my hand. This is snow. I couldn't tell if the powder was just inherently dirty when it fell from the sky, or if it had collected here in the frigid confines of this big empty building and let layer after layer of forgotten dust settle on top. Turning my gaze upward, I saw that the surrounding structure was even more massive than I'd first suspected. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that I was now standing in a Russian vehicle assembly building, the same such structure that was used by NASA to build the old Saturn V rockets to the moon, and, of course, used to attach the shuttle to the towering external fuel tank. The vacated condition of the building led me to believe that somehow, in some unexplainable way, my ship had, in fact, landed safely as intended. It had done so not merely minutes ago, but perhaps more than a decade prior to my ride ending. How or why this might have happened, I wouldn't even so much as speculate. Standing there, lost in my thoughts, I heard a distant, prolonged creaking sound, the labored efforts of some kind of support assembly, straining to maintain or uphold something overwhelmingly heavy above it. As the sound trailed off to a low groan, a gentle rustle that reminded me of sandy granules pouring through a funnel took its place, all of this from the towering heights above me. I think it must have been daytime outside, most likely overcast, judging by the monochrome coloration in the few places where light was reaching in and casting across the crumbling structure. All at once, a shower of tiny cold pellets rained down over me like a miniaturized avalanche, enough of the little crystals to pile up in a mound at my feet and sufficiently bury both of my space boots. Casting a sideways glance to make sure my exit route was still in place, I decided to have a short look around this incredibly magnificent piece of desolation before stumbling on to the next wild ride. Directly behind my horrifically battered spacecraft was an imposing wall of dirty yellow catwalks, unused crane hooks, and a latticework of tall scaffolding that looked like it somehow divided the chamber into two equally mammoth compartments. As I climbed higher and higher around the maze of platforms, I mistakenly thought I was seeing yet another bizarre spatial distortion. In between the bars and diagonal braces, I could make out the distinct shape of... what? Another spaceplane? A mere image? Maybe the scaffolding was less a collection of walkways for work crews and more of an event horizon that was generating two side-by-side versions of the exact same place and time. Okay, bud. Way too metaphysical for me. Slow it down, I said. Let's not jump to conclusions until you get a better look at the facts. As I pulled myself up to the tallest beam across the top of the last scaffold, I saw two items of interest that helped me to explain away all the wild theories, at least for a few mindless minutes of downtime. One, there really was another Buran orbiter on the other side of the hangar. Granted, I didn't jump down there and lay hands on the ship, but I'll lay odds that my eyes weren't playing tricks. Anyway, all other actions were placed on indefinite standby because of the other item of interest I found. A candy bar. Coated with the same dirty snow as everything else, but thankfully still in the wrapper and refrigerated, I held up the prize with unparalleled joy, ripped it open, and proceeded to crunch away like a starving madman. I can honestly say that it was the best piece of chocolate I have ever eaten. I couldn't read the label on the wrapper, but I stuffed it away in my pocket for safekeeping, another timeless treasure like the coin I found, a valuable conversation piece preserved for future reference. That is, if I ever find someone else to have that conversation with. As my blood sugar leveled off and started returning from a hyperglycemic flatline, I did a slow 360 panorama of the building for any additional points of interest. Off in the distance beyond the second Buran orbiter was a most impressive sight, the towering form of a massive Energia rocket, one and the same as the powerful heavy-lift launch vehicle that had carried me up into orbit. Or so I thought. Of all my varied and completely unrelated sojourns, this particular experience stood out as needing a serious reality check. Did I actually get hauled into space, or was it all some kind of elaborate hallucination? What if this entire thing is just some sophisticated form of virtual reality? For that matter, I suppose it's plausible that someone spiked my drink in the bar on Fuerteventura. A little far-fetched, I guess, though some of the explanation actually held a little water. If I had been drugged and subsequently passed out, maybe all of this, the American Star, the Pullman, this crazy shuttle launch, was just a series of VR scenarios, meaning I'm not really standing on a scaffold in a broken-down Soviet factory. I'm where? Still back in the Canary Islands? Standing in some sort of simulator, hooked up to wires and sensors, a guinea pig for an impressive new game engine? Suddenly, this was all making perfect sense. A much more believable narrative than the thought that I was actually jumping through random dimensional gateways that led to all these different places and times. The revelation actually coaxed me to laugh out loud. As the echoed cackles reverberated back to me, I said, "Very clever. How long have I been wired into this thing anyway? A few hours? Days? Even weeks? Huh? Well, it doesn't matter anyway. The gig is up. I've figured out your little game. And you know what? I'm not interested. I don't want to play anymore. I came to the Canary Islands for rest and relaxation. All of this, is not what I had in mind. You hear me? Someone, anyone, get your ass over here and take off the VR headset. Game over, man. Game over." I always wanted to use that last line for something, and damned if it wasn't the icing on the cake to finish up my little rant. Unfortunately, I guess the programmers must have gone for a soda and missed out. The scene didn't fade to black. No little Pac-Man jingle with points tallied up. Just more creaking from the rafters and another shower of dirty ice particles. "It's time for level 4, I said, resigned. Time to take another flying leap into my next nightmare. Retracing my steps down from the catwalk, I had just descended to the last rung of the ladder when all at once the occasional creaking from upstairs became an ear-splitting roar. I took off in a sprint, desperately trying to traverse the space between me and the spiraling portal before what must have been a total roof collapse could bury me under a mountain of rubble. Boulder-sized chunks of corrugated metal and steel I-beams hit the concrete floor all around me, sending fragments of wreckage in all directions. Heaps of dirty snow crashed on top of the discarded work areas, crushing tables and turning scattered tools into airborne projectiles that clattered against the walls and threatened to take me out as I ran. About halfway to my destination, I saw the wall next to my doomed orbiter start to crinkle and fall, buckling under tons of mangled rubble and snow. In one final act of heroism, Bran literally saved my life as I dived beneath her wing, avoiding the avalanche that was destroying this treasure trove of human endeavor in far less time than it had taken the genius to build. Clouds of soot bellowed out across the room and veiled all but a dim, muted halo of my doorway in choking brown haze. Scrambling back to my feet, I lunged toward the opening, hoping beyond hope that one of the falling slabs didn't have my name on it. 20 feet to go. 10 feet. 5 feet. Another countdown. How special. And then I jumped. Where to, you ask? Difficult to say with any degree of accuracy, though I hear Thailand is an especially nice place to visit these days. Beautiful beaches, breathtaking sunsets, everything a man needs to recharge his battery after the severities of life have taken their ruthless toll. I've even heard tell of a marvelous new attraction now anchored off the coast of Phuket, a recently refurbished crown jewel in Thailand's abundant roster of jet-setting tourist attractions. You should certainly check this one out, Mr. Addison. I'm sure you'll award it your unmitigated seal of approval. In fact, The last time you two met, she was only a ghost of what she has since become. The old girl will be glad to see you, I'm sure. And I understand she's had quite a makeover. I think she may just take your breath away. Episode 4 of the Thin Air Podcast Anthology, The Passenger Chapter 3, The Space Inbetween, was written, produced, directed, narrated, and told by R.J. Lonsdale. Music compositions used in this episode include Mysterious City and Echoes in Time by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. This has been an R.J. Lonsdale Flyby Studios presentation.